what would you say is a typical, I guess, phrase or like word of affirmation that you give to a wife who's like, struggling because her husband has, this addiction, this habit, this pattern, like you say? Like, what do you feel like is a good comforting thing to say? Like, things I've thought of are like, well, most men hide this from their wives. You having a husband that is actually honest and wanting to fix the problem, like that, he's already ahead of most men. And like, I'm just curious, what, like, when you're talking to women, like, what do you find to be the best comfort or best maybe science that you give them, or words of affirmation when they're going through this hard problem? Because like you said, it's not just the men that are really struggling, it's the women that don't feel appreciated, don't feel loved,
Yeah.
don't feel as if they're enough.
Yeah, it's tough. So the thing that I would say to women whose husbands are struggling with pornography is, number one, to know that there absolutely is hope. As difficult as this road feels, there's hope to get out of this. There's hope for him to heal. There's hope for you to heal. And getting education is one of the most important first steps that you can do, because the more you understand about pornography addiction or a habit, when people are caught in this spiral, the more you understand this, the more hope you feel, because there actually feels like a way out. If you don't understand this and your husband or your spouse or your partner tells you, I'm not going to do this again, and then he does, it leaves you feeling even more hopeless, because you thought it was going to be different this time and he said it would be different, but it's not. The key is to get education, to get the right tools, because once you have those things, you can actually start to see a difference.
Sure. And maybe once they have the education, they're able to help the partner instead of looking in from a view of like, maybe if they're a Christian, like, oh, my husband is ungodly, or maybe just from a secular view, oh, my husband is just unloyal, or like maybe they're actually able to understand what the biological mechanisms are occurring. Like maybe they're able to understand that, well, him watching is not saying to me that I'm not enough. It's that he has he has a trigger and he has a bad response to a trigger that needs to be updated. Like if they're able to maybe understand that, maybe there's maybe a little less pain between them. I'm just guessing maybe what.
You're right. That's a big part of it, because like you said, once a wife understands that when he's triggered, he's developed a conditioned, unhealthy response to it, once she understands that, it's easier for her to not take it as personally. Because it's like so many women will take that on themselves and think, I'm not enough, I'm inadequate, I'm not pretty enough, I'm not sexy enough.
Sure.
None of that is true. That's not why he turns to it. He's not unhappy with her, so he turns to it. He's just learned this conditioned, patterned response that when he gets triggered, he's taught his brain, he's conditioned his brain to turn to that outlet. So understanding that allows there to be some hope that that can change, and it helps her to start to heal as well, because so often, again, many women just they do take it personal, which I understand why. It makes sense why they would. But getting that education and understanding this helps them to not feel so bad or feel so heavy or responsible for it.
Sure. Yeah, that's really well said. And like I'm curious, like just from like a logistical perspective, like it's, if someone is watching porn, it's probably best that they tell their wife. But if they're a person who has a true habit that they've formed over the period of many years, I've found that sometimes instead of just explaining to your significant other, woman, etc., every time you have a problem, maybe it's going to someone like you, or going to someone who is like a mentor or a therapist or a coach or a counselor, any of the above. Do you feel like it's sometimes better to go to them instead of the wife every time? Or do you feel like every time they fail, they should go to their partner to like have that full honesty?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a lot of power when a man tells his spouse or girlfriend when he struggles, because most of the time a woman wants to know. And one of the reasons why it's so traumatic for them is because there's so much secrecy and deception around this. So the more forthcoming he is, the more secure she can feel. Because so many women will play the worst case scenario in their mind, when so often what's happening is different than what she's imagining it to be. If he can tell her, this is what's happening, this is the scope, this is the extent, this is why, it helps to quiet some of the anxiety that she feels, wondering, because if she doesn't understand what he does or why he does this, then everything becomes a trigger. They go out to a restaurant and he sees an attractive woman there at the restaurant, let's say. or they're at the pool, or they're, at the grocery store. Everybody feels like a threat when she doesn't understand the extent or the scope of why he's struggling. So the more forthcoming he can be, the more that allows the relationship to have a platform of trust, because you can build trust by telling your spouse, hey, I'm struggling, or I slipped, and this is why, this is what I'm going to do about it. That provides a sense of security, because she can start to trust, if he struggles, he's going to tell me. I don't need to snoop through his phone. Snoop is not even the right word, because no woman wants to even do that. I don't need to, go searching through his phone. I don't need to be asking the right question. And if I don't ask the right question, I don't get the truth. She can be released of that responsibility, because that's not hers in the first place. She doesn't want to be doing that. So the more forthcoming he can be, the better. So I think that, most women want more information, not less. So if you're trying to restore your relationship, that's typically the best route.
Yeah, I would have to agree. My experiences, I've watched for 10 years. Over the past year, I've figured out that I can stop watching, and it's been good. But I had a previous girlfriend that was honestly broke up with me because it was such a problem. That kind of catapulted me to realize how big of a problem I really had, and that's kind of a little personal story. But I noticed, like, I'm seeing what those explanations that you're giving. I'm like, man, I was living through that. Like, I wasn't honest all the time because I didn't want her to feel crushed. But I've noticed that as you are more honest, and, currently with my girlfriend, she knows that I'm talking about porn on the regular with men. And I'm like, well, the reason I'm doing this is because I want to be more open and honest with everyone, so that now I have 50 people that hold me accountable. Then it's like, if I have that trigger, then it's like I think of all the people that I'm trying to help, and then it's like, oh, okay, yeah, I shouldn't watch, and I won't. I'm not a porn watcher. I am a person who doesn't watch porn and who helps people not watch porn. That's me. I'm Harley, and I've identified it, but I can totally see how people really find it so difficult to explain it to their woman, maybe especially for the first time. But yeah,
which I can empathize with the guys. It's. Like you said, the biggest fear or concern they have in sharing with their spouse or their girlfriend is they don't want to hurt her. And they know that if he were to slip back into that old pattern, it's going to hurt her. So it makes sense why he would want to keep that to himself. It makes sense why he would, want to avoid that conversation with her. But the reality is that literally 100 out of 100 times, I've heard a woman say that the thing that hurts more than the pornography itself is the deception. It's the lying. And when men start to understand that that's really the bigger problem, for so many women that I work with, they're like, I don't love it if he slips. Of course I don't like that, but I can work with that if he's honest. If he's not honest, I have nothing I can work with, because it undermines everything he says. Because so often, again, a lot of guys that I work with, they'll do what's called a staggered disclosure, where they'll tell a little bit of, they'll drip out a little truth. And she's like, okay, that makes sense. And he says, that's it, I promise. And then a month later, something else comes out. He's like, this really is it. I promise there's nothing more. So it's staggered, and it's kind of piece by piece, which makes it impossible for her to believe anything he says, even if he's telling the truth. Yeah. Because there's been so many moments where he said, this is it, and it really wasn't. It makes it so difficult for her to move forward. So when you can share the truth and say, I'm struggling with this, but I'm committed to making sure I overcome this, she can work with that. It's a scary conversation to have. But every time I've seen a husband do that, the results are way more positive than if he were to just try to minimize it and avoid it. Because the reality is that there's only two ways to handle this. Number one, you either confess, or number two, you get caught. Because it will always come out. So many women can feel when something's off. They might not be able to put their finger on why, but eventually it will come out, and the coming out of it without him revealing it himself causes way more damage than the behavior ever does.
Yeah, that's really well said. It's I'm kind of a big fan of Peterson, and he's a therapist, counselor, psychologist as well. And he was like, one thing I learned is that, no matter what, you'll never get away with anything. Maybe it will be later down the road, but at the end of the day, it will come back to bite you. And I find that to be really true in regards to this topic. I'm not wanting to explain this to her now, but it's well, you're just delaying the problem, and the problem is now growing on you. And so that's a big problem. And
Now you're dealing with two problems. That's right.
Exactly.
The two problems, it's the behavior, which of course causes damage, but secondly, now she doesn't trust anything you say. And that can be an even bigger hurdle to cross. It's possible to do still. It just makes it harder. It's just more, it's just more steps now, which is fine, right? It's worth going through the steps. But again, for anybody who's listening, if you're contemplating, like, should I tell her? The answer is yes, because eventually it comes out, and now you've got to deal with two issues, which is the trust and trying to describe and overcome this problem.
Sure. And from what I've kind of seen with some of my male friends and some of my female friends, I've kind of noticed that men are sometimes less emotionally intelligent than women. Like they might not express their feelings as much, whereas women are maybe better at that expression and maybe even better at tapping into, well, if their man isn't being honest or if their man is feeling off. Like it seems like, I think you said it well, where it's like, women can kind of feel if it's off, like, so hiding it is not going to work. She's going to be saying, like, there's something wrong. And, like, I don't know. One of my big messages to people is, like, be vulnerable with people in general. And I think it kind of all ties in with this, where it's like, your woman is going to appreciate it if you're vulnerable, because then she can feel the honesty. Even if it's so difficult, that honest vulnerability is 10 times better than the deceit and pretending it as if you're okay. And, yeah.
It's true. When you said that, I thought about a client that I remember working with. This was years ago. And the husband had an affair. And of course, it devastated his wife. And the affair partner worked with him at the same agency, the same, clinic or whatever he was doing for work. And so they came up with an agreement that he wasn't going to have any other conversations with this affair partner that wasn't absolutely necessary to accomplish the task they were doing at work. So no personal stuff, no like how you doings, all that was cut off other than what they had to talk about while they were at work. And so he was doing well with this, and the relationship ended with the affair partner. And then there was one week where, as he was leaving, the girl came up to him and was like, "Hey, how you doing? Like, what are you doing this weekend?" And he answered it very briefly. He's just like, things are fine. We're going to be going to dinner or something. He said some little short thing, and then he excused himself. And then when he came in, he got home, and as soon as he walked in the door, his wife looked at him and said, "What happened?" And he's like, "What do you mean?" She's like, "Something happened. Something's off. What went on?" And so in a split second, she knew that something was different, because he had this like anxious energy about him.
Oh,
he didn't say anything inappropriate, right? He wasn't trying to spark the relationship again with this other person, but he did violate the agreement that they had, which was he had a short little conversation, which was still like out of the bounds of what they discussed. As a result of that, the moment he stepped in the door, she could tell something was wrong. And so he told her, he said, "This is what happened. This is, this is how it all played out. And I need to do better. I need to make sure that I'm clearer with her. I'm going to send her a message. I'm going to send her an email," or, he came up with a plan of how to address that so it wouldn't keep happening. But it just goes to show you how intuitive women are. I think people in general, right? We have this ability we have a perceptive or like a keen sense of when something feels off, or not. And we obviously don't have a crystal ball. We don't always know when somebody's lying, but there is an energy with deception that people, just women in particular, pick up on that. And so there's no point in hiding it, because they can tell something's off. And just by hiding it, you're avoiding, you're just delaying the consequences. And like you said earlier, it's compounding. It's getting worse.
For sure. Yeah, that's well said. That's an interesting story